He walked barefoot through the dark. The stone beneath his feet was damp and warm, not like a floor, but like the inside of a mouth. Each step sank just slightly, as if the corridor breathed beneath him. The air was thick with incense, but the smell had gone sweet and clotted, like old myrrh poured over rotting flowers. Pope Francis did not falter. His white papal robe, what remained of it, trailed behind him in silence. The garment was stained, tattered at the hem, and embroidered with spirals that hadn't been there a month ago. His face was pale, his eyes sunk into shadow. But he smiled. The others followed behind, their forms concealed in black and red vestments. None of them spoke. Their mouths twitched beneath their hoods, muttering in a language no one dared teach. The corridor opened into a vast subterranean chamber. It had no lights, and yet everything was visible. The walls stretched high and uneven, shaped like an ancient cistern but carved by no hand. The surface of the stone glistened with moisture that trickled upward, not down. Faint patterns shimmered along the perimeter. Spirals, yes, but not human. Spirals that broke in impossible ways and resumed on unseen axes. A whisper pulsed through the room, not a sound, but a feeling, as if the stone itself remembered something and wanted you to remember it too. At the far end of the chamber stood an altar. Low, wide, dark, slick. It pulsed gently. Creatures lingered at the edges, just beyond the failing logic of light. One hunched and long-limbed, with knotted skin that drooped from its arms like wet linen. Another shifted sideways, never facing forward, always circling, bones clicking beneath its skin like distant knuckles cracking in prayer. Some whispered. Others chattered their teeth in rhythm, an irregular chorus echoing across the hollow stone. Their eyes reflected no light, only motion. They were waiting. And he had come. Francis reached the altar and knelt. The floor steamed where his knees met the stone. His fingers trembled, but not from fear. He dipped them into a silver basin resting on the altar's edge and anointed his own forehead with a viscous, dark fluid. One of the red-robed clergy approached, bearing a crown. It was not made of gold. It was made of bone, spiraled and tooth-marked, wrapped with hair so long and colorless it seemed to move in slow, syrupy wind. The priest lifted the crown high above his head, and the chattering ceased. Every creature fell silent, and then the stone itself moaned. It began low, like the shifting of a mountain, then rose into a hungry whine. Cracks opened along the floor. From within them poured a light so dim it seemed to subtract from the air around it. The priest lowered the crown. But before it touched Francis's head, he looked up, directly into the darkness beyond the altar. Something was moving there. Something immense. The creatures leaned in. The priest held his breath. And Francis smiled. It had begun on a rainless night 6 months earlier. He had awoken in his private quarters, not to sound, not to light, but to the absence of both. The air in the papal residence had gone still. The frescoes on the walls, usually benign, now seemed to watch. And something was sitting in the chair near the window. Not someone. Something. Its form was not visible, not entirely. It shimmered like heat rising from a dead road, pulling the room inward. A robe of crimson shadow folded around it, but the shape beneath was unclear, too tall, too narrow, like someone who had been stretched by memory itself. Francis sat upright in his bed, heart silent. Not pounding, silent, as if afraid to interrupt. The figure tilted its head. It did not speak. But the message came anyway. You are not the last. You are the first. Francis blinked. A vision bloomed across the room. Not a dream, not a hallucination. A memory, but not his. He saw a throne, not on earth, but floating in a space of gray fire. It pulsed with spirals, each one opening into another. Kneeling before it were hundreds, priests, bishops, saints, not in worship but in transformation. Their flesh melted. Their mouths multiplied. Their eyes curled inward into endless pupilless depth. And standing behind the throne, unseen but known, was something vast. A lord. Of memory. of hunger, of return. Francis understood, in that instant, what had been buried beneath the Vatican for centuries. What had been fed. What had been remembered. "You will not die," the voice said. "You will descend." The figure vanished. No footstep. No departure. Just gone. The frescoes on the wall cracked silently. The next morning, Pope Francis smiled at breakfast. When asked if he had slept, he said yes. But he hadn't. He hadn't closed his eyes once. Because they had been closed for him. He began walking at night. Not just the gardens. The halls. The catacombs. Places no one else entered. Places that opened only when he whispered. Places that welcomed him like an old friend. He did not speak of the vision. Not to his advisors. Not to his confessor. Not to the cardinals who watched his movements with growing unease. Instead, Francis waited, until the next moonless night, when the Vatican's inner corridors fell quiet, when even the guards at the eastern post yawned between rotations. Then, barefoot and alone, he left his quarters and made his way downward. Not toward the archives. Not toward the crypt. Lower. To a corridor most thought sealed since the 1800s, a narrow, dust-choked hall where the air turned humid and the lights flickered before they were even turned on. He didn't need a key. He touched the stone with his fingers and it opened. The path wound in impossible ways. Steps that turned inward on themselves. Doors with no hinges. He passed frescoes so faded they seemed blank, until he saw them with his peripheral vision. Spirals, yes, but pulsing with color only memory could recall. At the base of the stairwell, the world changed. There were no lights. No echo. The Vatican above no longer felt present. Even time had altered. His watch stopped ticking, and his heart slowed to match the rhythm of the breathing walls. Yes, the walls were breathing. In and out like the lungs of a beast older than breath itself. Veins pulsed along the ceiling, flesh veins, not roots. They crisscrossed the corridor like a forgotten umbilical network, leading deeper. He followed. The corridor opened into a round chamber, a small one, carved from obsidian black stone that gleamed as if wet. There was no furniture, no altar, no symbol. Just a pool in the center. Shallow. Still. The surface reflected nothing. Francis stepped closer. Looked down. It didn't show his face. It showed its own. A spiral eye, wide and lidless. A crown of bone. A field of mouth. The reflection blinked. And when he flinched, so did it. He stayed until morning. When he returned, no one noticed. His face looked normal. His smile was unchanged. But beneath his robes, his spine ached, not from age, but because it was beginning to lengthen. The second descent came easier. The hallway lit itself as he passed. The pulsing slowed when he approached, as though the structure had begun to recognize him, to welcome him. This time there were voices. Not shouting. Not singing. Whispering, dry as rust, curling through the corridor like wind through parchment. The language was old, wet-sounding, riddled with consonants and inhaled vowels. He didn't know it, but he understood. Each word settled into his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Each phrase rewrote a memory. At the far wall, he found a new chamber had opened. It hadn't been there the first night. Or perhaps it had, and he hadn't been allowed to see it yet. Inside, he saw them. Not clearly. Just the edges. They crouched in the corners, curled around old columns and broken idols. Limbs too long, arms bent the wrong way. Some blinked side to side. Others didn't blink at all. Their flesh pulsed in rhythm with the whispering. And their teeth, always their teeth, chattered softly like a choir warming up their throat. They didn't approach, but they watched. Francis did not recoil. He didn't cross himself. He didn't pray. He simply bowed. And their chatter stopped. One of them moved forward. It was smaller than the others. Cloaked in robes, the same color as dried blood. Its hands were visible, though, long and cracked like tree bark, fingers ending in nails that tapered like styluses. It lifted its hands and traced a shape into the air. A spiral. It stopped just in front of him and placed one hand on his chest. Francis felt everything. Not pain. Not heat. Recognition. His ribs shifted inward slightly. And he smiled. That night, he returned to his chambers and bled from his gums. His fingernails grew soft and red. He did not sleep. Instead, he spent the night walking barefoot in a perfect circle in his private chapel, repeating the words he now knew without ever learning. In the morning, he delivered a homily that no one remembered. By the end of the week, he had descended 4 more times. The walls had begun responding. When he entered the stone corridors, the breathing increased. When he spoke aloud, the creatures twitched with delight. One night, as he stepped into the central chamber, he found the black pool boiling gently. Not with heat, with hunger. He approached and kneeled. A whisper reached his ears, inside his ears, behind them, within his very bones. The altar remembers your spine. The mouth knows your name. You are the final echo before the waking. He lowered his head into the water. It accepted him. It welcomed him. The next morning, one of the papal guards asked if he needed assistance. Francis turned. His eyes glowed faintly beneath the lids. He shook his head, smiled, then said, "Not assistance. Witnesses." It began subtly. Francis was simply unavailable. He skipped one morning meeting, then another. When the papal secretary entered the apostolic palace at sunrise, the pope's chair was empty. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched, the gospel book unopened beside it. His cassock was folded on the chair, as if placed there deliberately. No one had seen him leave. No one heard the door. It was assumed he was praying. The man had grown contemplative in his final years. Solitude wasn't uncommon. But by the 3rd day of absence, the whispering began. Staff claimed he had taken to walking the gardens at night, that his window remained lit well into the pre-dawn hours. Some said they saw him standing at the balcony, silhouetted against candlelight, his arms lifted not in blessing, but in supplication. When asked about it, Francis only smiled and said, "The sun hides what must be known." He never elaborated. His public schedule began to change. Afternoon appearances only. Papal audiences were delayed or cancelled. He missed 3 consecutive morning masses, an act unheard of in centuries. When a visiting bishop commented on the Pope's health, noting how pale he seemed, Francis gently touched his hand and whispered, "I am only pale in your light." In his, "I am blooming." The bishop didn't ask again. Photographs taken by the press began to show subtle aberrations. At first, nothing obvious, just shadows falling in the wrong direction. Light that bent strangely across the marble. The Pope's silhouette appearing slightly delayed, as if the camera struggled to catch up to his outline. In one image, never published, a single spiral had appeared in the air behind his head, visible only in the negative. When asked about the distortion, the Vatican press office responded with a generic technical explanation. But the technician who developed the photo had already left the building, trembling, muttering that the image had spoken back. The spiral began to show up elsewhere. A cleaner discovered one carved into the floor of the Pope's private elevator. Not scratched, grown like lichen, soft and dark and slightly wet. It pulsed when touched. The cleaning staff was instructed not to report it. In the papal apartments, a small crucifix was found split along its base, its wooden arms bent slightly inward, curving not in pain, but in motion. Behind it, on the wall, the plaster had crumbled in a perfect loop, like a coil of ash. Beneath it, someone had scrawled a phrase in soot. "He sleeps less because he is waking." Outside the walls of the Vatican, pigeons stopped nesting in St. Peter's Square. The air changed. The bells still rang, but on overcast mornings, the sound seemed to fold inward rather than echo. The vibrations pressed into the chest, thick, reverent, and wrong. Pilgrims standing in the square whispered of strange dreams. One woman from Argentina claimed she saw the Pope in her hotel mirror. She turned, expecting him to be behind her. He wasn't. But when she looked back, the reflection was still there. Francis no longer wore his traditional cassock during private mass. He wore a robe of deep crimson and black, laced with silver embroidery that twisted in spirals along the cuffs and collar. His ring had changed too, no longer the fisherman's ring of St. Peter, but a heavy piece of twisted iron, blackened and old. No one could identify its origin. When asked about it, he replied, "This was not forged. It was remembered." In the evenings, he spent hours alone in the crypt beneath the basilica. The guards posted nearby began to rotate more frequently. Those who stayed more than one shift at a time reported odd behavior, whispers behind the walls, heat radiating from stone, the feeling of breath on their neck. One guard left his post trembling, unable to explain why he had removed his shoes and stood barefoot for 2 hours without memory of doing so. Another claimed to hear chanting through the wall, dozens of voices repeating his name, but not his title. Not Pope, not Holy Father, just Francis, Francis, Francis. The College of Cardinals became concerned. Several high-ranking officials attempted a private inquiry. A formal letter was prepared, delicately worded, citing concern for health, mental clarity, and the burden of divine office. They never delivered it. One by one, each cardinal reported strange incidents. One saw the Pope standing motionless in a dark corridor, eyes glowing faintly as if lit from within. Another opened a drawer to find pages written in their own hand, pages they had no memory of writing. Each line was the same. "He speaks in the dark so we may remember in the light." The letter was burned. No further inquiries were made. That week, during a small private address in the Apostolic Palace, Francis paused mid-sentence. He looked around the room, then smiled and said, "Do you hear it now?" No one responded. He placed a hand on his chest, just below the sternum. "It speaks softly. Because it has always been here." He did not continue the address. He simply walked out. And every attendee dreamt of spirals that night. It began with a rash, red, coiled, just beneath the ribcage. Or that's what the Vatican physician called it the first time he noticed. Francis had raised his robe slightly during a routine check, revealing a patch of skin marked by a perfect spiral, thin as hair and dark as ash. It pulsed faintly, not with blood, but like it was breathing. The physician, startled, asked to examine it more closely. Francis said nothing. He simply lowered his robe and smiled. The physician didn't return for the next scheduled appointment. Rumors spread that he'd withdrawn from service, citing personal revelations. His belongings were packed in silence. He never spoke to the press, but his journal, leaked anonymously online weeks later, contained page after page of one phrase written over and over. "It sees through me." Days passed. The spiral returned. This time on the inside of the Pope's palm. Then his left shoulder. Then across his back, as if being drawn from within. The marks didn't scab. Didn't fade. They seemed to rise from beneath the flesh. Some nights, under candlelight, he stood shirtless in the private chapel and traced them slowly with his fingers, mouthing a language no one had taught him. Not prayer. Not Latin. The spiral's own tongue. The mirrors were the next to react. One morning, a maid reported that the mirror in Francis's bedroom no longer showed him. It showed someone. But not him. Not exactly. It was the right height. The same outline. But the figure in the reflection had no eyes, and its skin bent inward in places, pulsing with small movements just under the surface. The mirror was removed that day. Replaced by a wooden crucifix. That evening, the crucifix cracked, bled. Everywhere the Pope went, the spiral began to echo. Not physically, but in impression. The frescoes in the Hall of Benedictions warped just slightly, like the curvature of the walls had softened. The windows caught sunlight wrong, refracting it in circular halos rather than lines. Even his footsteps began to echo oddly, spiraling outward rather than back. Once, when he stood at the main altar alone, a gust of warm air rose from beneath the marble. No vent. No breeze. Just a whisper. One who spirals is never lost. He closed his eyes and whispered back. The clergy noticed, of course they did, but their protests grew quiet. Those who spoke up grew sick. Those who persisted bled from their gums. And one, an old Monsignor who publicly denounced the Pope's changes to doctrine, was found kneeling in his own quarters, hands folded, a spiral burned into the wood beneath him. He was dead, but smiling. The Pope no longer sat for portraits. He no longer looked into cameras, and slowly, it seemed, people stopped remembering his face clearly. They spoke of him in metaphor: the white shadow, the coiled light, the shepherd of memory. Those who were closest to him began avoiding direct eye contact. One whispered in confession that his eyes were no longer eyes, but holes waiting to be filled. Another, when asked why she wept after delivering him wine, replied only, "Because he remembered my sins before I confessed them." Then came the robe. He no longer wore the cassock. He appeared in public wearing a dark, spiral-laced garment stitched from what looked like mothwing and velvet, too thin, too organic, and always trailing behind him even without wind. It shimmered strangely in light. Some claimed it was made of language. Others believed it wasn't fabric at all, but woven from thought, stitched by the creatures below as they waited for his full return. The Vatican's high chapel grew colder. Despite efforts to heat it, a draft spread across the pews. Not cold like winter, but wet, like breath. Beneath the altar, the stone floor changed color. The center turned black, the grain in the marble swirling, slow but certain. Priests began avoiding the space. The scent of wet ash lingered, no matter how many times the area was cleaned. They called it the new wound. And some nights the floor whispered. There had always been rumors of deeper catacombs, older chambers. Before Christianity, before Rome, before memory. Few had seen them, fewer returned. But Francis walked them freely now. He no longer asked for torchlight. He no longer brought a rosary. He no longer needed guides. The door opened for him when he whispered the spiral aloud. Each visit, he descended farther. And each time, more of them waited. Not many at first, but now dozens. They lined the walls like statues. They moved subtly, one twitching its neck sideways, another dragging its fingers along the ground in lazy circles. None identical. Some dripped. Some had no mouth. Some had mouths in the wrong places. Some wore garments from centuries long gone. Each chattered their teeth when he passed. Not in fear. In reverence. He brought 3 cardinals with him once. Just once. They had asked questions. Grown bold. Demanded answers. So he brought them. Down the spiral stair. Through the veil of heat and ash. Into the chamber. He said nothing. He only gestured for them to observe. One wept. One dropped to his knees and began praying to something unseen. The third turned and ran. Only 2 returned. When questioned, the kneeling cardinal said, "He did not fall. He was chosen. He was eaten only in form." The one who fled spoke no more. He left his office within the week. Francis visited the teeth. He called it that now. A chamber beneath the chamber, filled with rows of teeth carved into stone. Not decoration. Not bone. Just teeth, rows and rows of them, forming an amphitheater around a circular pool of black reflection. He sat in its center. And the whispers began again. They came not from above, not below, but from behind his breath. The spiral is the eye of the world. The mouth is where belief becomes fact. You are the answer, because you remember the question. He chanted. The walls pulsed, and high above the dome, the bells cracked. They had always known the basilica was alive. They just hadn't known what fed it. Francis stood alone at night beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Above him, the frescoes gleamed faintly, though no lights were lit. The building groaned softly, as if adjusting itself in its foundations. He stood still, barefoot on the altar's marble slab, and waited. A breeze rose through the cracks, not from vents or ducts, but from beneath the stone itself. It was warm, humid, and when it touched his skin, his eyes rolled back ever so slightly, as if to welcome the memory. He removed the fisherman's ring, dropped it into the mouth-shaped grate at his feet. The marble began to soften. The ground at the center of the nave had begun to change in recent days. At first, only a discoloration, black veins spidering through the white stone in curving, coiled patterns. Then, a depression formed, circular, shallow. The workers who tried to polish it found their hands going numb. One slipped and cut his palm. The blood hissed when it hit the stone. By the next morning, the mark had spread a full meter in radius. No tools worked. No substance stayed. The marble rejected intrusion. Francis didn't allow repair. He simply called it the cradle. At night, the transformation accelerated. The depression deepened. Tiny fissures opened around the edges. Jagged, flesh-like, ringed with what looked like cracked enamel. And then came the noise. Not loud, low. A suction. A murmur. Like something breathing in reverse. Francis would stand above it, arms spread, repeating the name he had not spoken aloud since the pact was made. Agnomina. 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 With each repetition, the fissures widened. Not violently, but willingly. The marble was giving way. The spiral was taking hold. On the fourth night, the mouth opened. Not a sinkhole. Not an illusion. A literal mouth. Ringed with jagged stone teeth, veined with memory, filled with a black tongue that moved not like muscle, but like ink. Francis knelt before it. And it spoke. Not in sound, but in sensation. A vibration in his lungs. A burning behind his tongue. It showed him visions, endless cathedrals of bone, galaxies coiling into spirals, 1,000 popes weeping in reverse. And the final image. Him. Standing at the center of the spiral. Crown. Inhuman. Remembered. He knew now the coronation would not be symbolic. It would be physical. Literal. Irreversible. He chose them carefully. 12 men. Once high-ranking. Now forgotten. Once bishops. Now vessels. Each had been summoned through letters written in Francis's own hand, inkless, burned into vellum, delivered in silence. No signature. Just the spiral seal. They arrived at night. Escorted without guards. Dressed in robes of a style long erased from church record, black on black, threaded with whisper script and jawbone motif. They did not speak on arrival. They only knelt. Their purpose was singular: prepare the way. They descended daily into the spiral halls below the Vatican, where the air turned thick and sweet, where memory clung to the walls like smoke. There, the creatures waited, not idle, but arranging. Stones were moved. Symbols traced in ichor. A great throne was assembled, neither wood nor stone, but formed from spirals hardened into matter. At its base, the crown. Spiked, eyeless, wet with something that hadn't dried in centuries. Francis descended often now. Not nightly. Constantly. He no longer remained above for more than an hour or two. His papal quarters were found abandoned, dust gathering, mirrors covered. No personal belongings remained. He slept in the catacombs. Or perhaps he didn't sleep at all. Witnesses said his eyes no longer blinked. He no longer cast a shadow. The spiral priest sang. No mouths opened. No sound escaped. But still, the walls shook. The breath of the Lord stirred. The altar in the chamber of teeth dripped with memory, thick, pearlescent fluid pooling like the condensation of time itself. Each drop sizzled against the stone. Francis would kneel, collecting it in a silver bowl, anointing his own chest with it. Where once there was skin, now there was pattern. His ribs showed through, but not as bone, as coiled script. Every breath he took hummed with distant voices. The creatures grew restless. They crept closer to the spiral altar each day. Chattering. Clicking. One approached Francis directly, pressed a clawed finger to his sternum, and whispered, not into his ear, but into his lungs. And he understood. The coronation was scheduled for the equinox. Not publicly, not in Vatican record, but in the old calendar, the one never written but always known. The day when shadow matched light. The day when remembrance bled into presence. The spiral priests would form the outer ring, the creatures the inner, and Francis would take the center. He no longer spoke of death. He no longer spoke of God. He only whispered of becoming. When the Archbishop of Krakow asked to see him, Francis agreed. The Archbishop entered the subterranean chamber, shaking. He had expected candles. Instead, he found roots pulsing in the ceiling, red light spilling from the floor, and a pope who no longer resembled man. Francis stood taller. His hands had grown long. His voice echoed before he spoke. He placed his hand on the Archbishop's head. "You may still flee," he said. "But you will forget how." The Archbishop did not run. He simply wept, and kissed the spiral beneath Francis's feet. The bells didn't ring that morning. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't scheduled maintenance. It was as if the bronze themselves had been told to hold their breath. Above the basilica, the air was heavy, unnaturally warm for a spring morning. Pilgrims moved through St. Peter's Square in a kind of daze, whispering to one another without realizing they were doing it. Latin words slipped from their mouths, fragments of liturgy no one had taught them. Non lumen, non tenebrae, recordatio, not light, not dark, only remembrance. The sun rose low and gold behind the dome, but the shadows beneath it bent in a slow arc, spiraling just slightly, like everything was leaning inward. Below, the spiral choir gathered. They didn't stand in pews. They stood in rings, 5 concentric circles of hooded, silent clergy, each humming a note too low to be captured by the human ear. Their voices were not projected from their mouths, but from their chests, from the very base of their spines. Each wore the mark, not on robes, on flesh. Spirals branded across their backs and hands, as if memory itself had begun to write on them. In the center of the chamber, Francis stood, barefoot, robed in a garment that rippled like black water. His chest was uncovered, showing ribs etched with glyph. Not spiral this time, but a language older than shape. His face was no longer quite his. Still recognizable, but subtly misaligned. His eyes had no whites. His mouth curved slightly in both directions. He didn't smile. He revealed. The throne behind him had grown. What began as a ring of smooth black stone was now an impossible structure, ascending coils of petrified thought, sculpted by unseen hands. It had no clear seat. It had no clear top. But it waited. The choir's hum deepened. Stone vibrated. And the altar cracked. Above ground, every crucifix in the basilica shifted, just slightly, no more than half a degree. But it was enough. Enough to tilt the eyes of Christ downward. Not toward humanity, but toward the earth beneath it. The creatures arrived first. Dozens of them, moving in unnatural silence, slithering and limping and gliding from the tunnels. Some wore the skins of old clergy. Some bled light from their mouth. Some carried relics that had never belonged to this world, pages bound in teeth, censers that dripped smoke shaped like eyes. They encircled the Pope, kneeling, chattering softly, teeth clacking in a rhythm that made the floor pulse in reply. They were not guests. They were family, and they had returned for their brother. One creature, taller than the rest, crowned in what looked like antlers made of vertebrae, approached the altar. It carried the crown, a spiraled, bone-white ring wrapped in a braid of ancient, mummified tongues. It hummed low and slow with every movement. Francis turned to face it. He knelt. The creature placed the crown on his head. Not roughly, but reverently. The choir exhaled in unison. The chamber went still. Then the stone beneath Francis's feet cracked open like an egg. He did not fall. He descended. Lower. Through the altar. Through the teeth. Through the mouth of the earth. There was never a resignation. There was no speech. No signature. No conclave. There was only the announcement. Pope Francis had stepped down for reasons of age and health. that he had retired in silence to a life of prayer. No one saw him leave. No photos were released. No addresses given. Just a curtain drawn. And the echo of bells that never rang. The world believed it. For a few days. Then the signs began to spread. In Buenos Aires, his image on a mural began to bleed from the mouth. In Krakow, a chapel ceiling collapsed, revealing a hidden spiral etched into the foundation below. In Manila, a priest dreamt of Francis every night, naked, crowned, speaking in reverse. The Vatican denied everything. But no new pope was chosen. And the fisherman's ring? Still locked in the vault, untouched. In secret chambers, the College of Cardinals met. They whispered of what they feared, what they remembered: the spiral gospel, the catacomb crown, the womb beneath the altar. One cardinal suggested convening a new conclave. Another said, "How can we elect another when the throne is no longer ours?" Silence. Then one, trembling, whispered, "He is not gone. He is becoming." Back below, Francis stood in the heart of the spiral. The world above grew more distant, like a childhood story half remembered. Here, time did not pass. Here, nothing ended, because nothing had ever truly begun. He stood before the true altar now, a column of memory, spiraled into matter, surrounded by creatures who no longer wore the pretense of form. And from the depths of the spiral, the Lord stirred. Not awake, not asleep, just watching. Francis lifted his arms, and every mouth, human and not, spoke his name. But it was no longer Francis. There was no more day. Not for him. He could still feel the concept of sunlight like an echo, something he once knew in another form. But warmth, in the way humans understood it, was gone. Now it came from the deep, from the breath of something vast and never born. Francis no longer walked upright all the time. His body adapted. Some corridors in the lower catacombs were not made for human posture. He crawled sometimes, slithered others. The bones of his spine had begun to shift, not breaking, but folding, realigning to match the curvature of the winding paths. When he moved too quickly, he could hear the vertebrae clicking softly in sequence, like a chant. His lungs had thickened, no longer labored, even in the thick, damp air below. He didn't cough. He didn't tire. He no longer slept. Sleep was for those who forgot. Francis remembered now. He remembered everything. The spiral priests, what remained of them, followed at a distance, their bodies hollowed by ritual. Their robes clung to nothing. They no longer ate. They no longer bled. And their eyes had filled with a clear, humming fluid that vibrated when they passed too near the mouth. Each carried a relic. One bore the remains of the first failed pope, a skull wrapped in vellum, still chattering quietly when handled. Another carried a bell that rang in inward peals, silencing not the air, but the thoughts of any nearby. Francis carried nothing. He was the relic now. The final chamber had no entrance. It simply was, and once remembered, it revealed itself. It waited at the deepest part of the spiral, the core of the wound, the base of the old Vatican's forgotten foundation. There was no stone here, no construction. Only flesh. Vast. Black. Breathing. And it did not breathe like lungs. It pulsed. Like the earth itself exhaled through it. Here lay the Lord beneath. Not a creature. Not a devil. Not a god. Something else. Something older than belief, yet always believed. Francis stood at the edge of the womb, the great hollow wound where saints were unmade and memory was fed. Tentacles rose from the pit. Not violently. Not reaching. Offering. Around them women waited. Dozens. Silent. Empty-eyed. Their bellies distended with light that pulsed blue and yellow and green. Each was attached to the pit by thin threads of living flesh, umbilical and reverent. Not held. Nourished. One turned to him. She was weeping from her ears, and she smiled. Francis disrobed. Slowly. With care. The black garment sloughed from his shoulders like wet parchment. Beneath it, his flesh had become marked by spirals carved in relief, some deep enough to show glimpses of light beneath his skin. His ribs shifted. His jaw unlatched with a soft click. The spiral priests began to hum, and the floor beneath him grew slick. He stepped forward into the pit, not with fear, but with welcome. It was not a feast of flesh. There was no tearing, no gnashing. The creatures did not devour him with violence. They took him apart with worship. One approached and placed its hand against his forehead. Its palm had no texture, just a shifting membrane of eyes that blinked slowly, one by one. Another pressed its mouth to his chest, not to bite, but to whisper into the bone. The words echoed through him like fire, curling around his ribs, lighting the spirals into full clarity. A third placed its clawed fingers gently into his back, and drew out his spine like a rope of light. Francis did not cry out. He laughed. His mouth opened wide, then wider, wider than bone allowed. His jaw cracked at both hinges, dangling like a curtain, and something spoke through him. He is not crowned. He is curled. He is not chosen. He is grown. He does not serve the church. The church was his cradle. The priests began to chant, falling prostrate. The spiral on the floor ignited. Not with fire, with thought. And then the transformation began. His legs bent backward first, knees cracking into reverse angles. His feet elongated, toes flattening into wide, soft pads that pulsed with each heartbeat. His hands grew new digits, slender and spiraled, with joints that bent in 3 directions. The mouth on his face was not the only one now. 2 smaller mouths formed below his ears. Another in the hollow of his throat. All whispering. None using breath. The Lord responded. It did not rise. It opened. A single eye, larger than the dome of St. Peter's, unfurled from the dark, blinking with a sound like bone dragged across stone. It stared at Francis with no emotion, no approval. Only recognition. It had seen him before. It would see him again. It would always see him. The creatures stepped back. Francis rose. Taller now. Wider. Not monstrous, but true. His body was a sermon no longer bound to language. The spirals on his skin moved slowly, like galaxies forming. His fingers extended, and each priest remembered their place. Above, in Vatican Square, the cobblestones cracked in unison. A spiral formed in the ground. Tourists screamed. Birds flew upward, then froze midair, as if unsure whether to return. Inside the basilica, statues wept black resin. One crucifix crumbled completely. Back below, Francis turned to the mouth of the pit. Spoke one final phrase. Not to the Lord, but to the world. This was never resignation. This was reclamation. He stepped fully into the spiral. The chamber erupted in light. And the spiral, at last, sang. They thought he stepped down. They thought he vanished into prayer, into silence, into some private chamber of rest and frailty. But beneath the Vatican, beneath the bones of the Church, beneath the bones of Rome itself, he rose again. Just as it had begun. The coronation chamber was exactly as it had been on that first night. Vast. Slick with breath. Lit from nowhere and everywhere. Francis, or what he had become, stood at the center, bare, crowned, and pulsing with thought. His form was no longer bound by age. His spine stretched in elegant arcs. His skin, marked by layered spirals, shimmered with something just beneath it, memory, alive and coiling. He turned slowly. The spiral priests knelt in rings. The creatures stood at full height now, some glowing from within, others weeping strands of radiant liquid. Their mouths clicked softly in syncopated worship. At the outer edge of the room, the Lord's eye remained open, watching, waiting, breathing. This was not ceremony. It was recognition. Every being in the room had waited centuries, some longer, and now the throne was full. The Pope had not abdicated. He had graduated. High above, at that same hour, the Vatican press room went dark. Across Europe, church bells rang off schedule. In Jerusalem, an imam awoke in the night, drawing a spiral in the dust and weeping without knowing why. In Mexico City, a child pointed at the sky and asked, "Why is it moving like water?" It was. The stars shifted. Subtly. Slowly. But enough. Inside the basilica, the altar bled. The stone cross dissolved. Its remnants curled on the marble like burned script. And beneath it, on the steps of the altar, something breathed. A spiral etched itself in heat. Those present that morning spoke of a whine, not quite audible but felt in the sternum. An announcement. A birth pang. Back below, the spiral throne opened. Francis stepped into it. It accepted him like a missing tooth. The throne folded around his form, spiraling upward, grafting itself to him with a sound like closing scripture. The moment he sat, the floor shuddered. From deep within the catacombs, a sound rose, not a roar, but a chant. Millions of whispers saying nothing intelligible, yet perfectly understood. He looked up. Not with his eyes, those had vanished hours ago. He saw with his memory. The world as it was. The world as it would be. The spiral turning across ages, drawing closer to completion. You called me Pope. You thought me shepherd. But I was always the mouth. And when he spoke again, every mirror in the Vatican cracked. The church above began to change. Slowly. But undeniably. Statues bent in their niches. Frescoes peeled themselves into coils. Confessionals echoed with voices that didn't belong to the living. Pilgrims spoke in tongues that hadn't been heard since the world was fluid and unformed. No conclave was called. No new pope was announced. Instead, a letter appeared on every desk in the College of Cardinals, identical, unsigned, written in Latin that had no record. Its closing line was, "He remembers you. Do you remember him?" Some resigned. Some wept. Some knelt. And above it all, the stars spun wrong. A new age had begun. Not of Christ. Not of Antichrist. But of remembrance. The Pope did not step down. He stepped below. And the world, turning still, followed, whether it knew it or not.